Thank you for being here tonight. So good to see you. If you have your Bible, you can be finding the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, and we'll stay there for the entirety of my portion tonight. Very simple goal objective here. I just wanted to talk about Isaiah. We recently brought him up in our Friday morning study, and he makes an appearance in 2 Kings. And I think for a lot of us, we know about Isaiah in terms of we know that he gave many messianic prophecies. We usually use Isaiah when we do Lord's Supper talks, and we'll quote Isaiah. But sometimes if we try to ask, the average Christian, well, who was Isaiah? What did he do? What did he talk about? It usually only goes as far as that, right? So I thought it would just be beneficial just to kind of go over the story of Isaiah and some of the common themes of Isaiah that would just make us a little bit more better prepared if we were ever going to study this book. And I think there's some messages here as we go through, and the lesson will be yours. What I want to do simply is just go over the story of the timeline first and then bring out some of those core themes at the end. Isaiah is living in the 8th century during the divided kingdom, and most of his work is going to be in the days of Hezekiah, but he lives over the course of about 5 kings. And he's in Judah, probably specifically in Jerusalem, and he's working with these kings and working with these people in Judah. The first king that he mentions he's under is Uzziah. If you remember Uzziah, he was a good king. And chapter 6 of Isaiah begins with Uzziah just passing, and that's when he is commissioned to be a prophet. If you're in Isaiah, look at chapter 6. Many of you that have studied this book before, you know that the first chapters of Isaiah is just an intro, and it's sort of a setting and explaining about what's going on during the days of Isaiah. Chapter 6 is actually when Isaiah begins and starts working as a prophet. Verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filling the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. The 2 covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Obviously, where we get the hymn, Holy, 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 right? Isaiah, at the very end of King Uzziah, when he dies, he was a good king. Isaiah is taken up to the throne of God, and he's commissioned to be one of God's prophets. And many of you that were in the Leviticus class last year, in the adult class, if you remember, we talked often about how Moses would call some things holy, and he would call some things most holy. So obviously, the inner tabernacle was holy, but the inner sanctum of the tabernacle was most holy. And if you remember, we made the point that the word most isn't in the Hebrew Bible. And apparently the Hebrews didn't even have a word that meant most. So what Moses really said was he would say that the tabernacle is holy, but the inner sanctum, he would say not most holy, but holy, holy, right? And it's sort of silly in English to think that someone would say, well, this is holy, well, this is holy, holy. But the people were familiar with that vernacular. They were familiar with things being holy or holy, holy. Well, here for the very first time, when God appears to Isaiah, what do these spiritual beings, these seraphim, say about God? Well, they don't just say he's holy. They don't just say he's holy, holy. What do they say? He's holy, holy, holy. He's set apart 3 times, and that is the first time God has ever been recognized as that. And of course, it's very fitting to recognize him as that. We don't see that term used again until Revelation chapter 4, where Jesus is presented as holy, holy, holy. So this is when Isaiah begins. Isaiah lives through Jotham, who was a good king, but he didn't tear down the high places. And he lives through Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, who was a wicked king and tried to bring in some of the idolatry back into the land. But the silver lining in the life of Isaiah is Hezekiah's reign, who we remember the most and certainly has the most significance for God's people. Right there at the beginning of Hezekiah's reign, the end of Ahaz's, the Assyrian kingdom begins taking over. His father, Ahaz, had to pay off the Assyrian empire from taking over Judah just to keep them out of the land, which is sort of a wicked way of handling it. However, when Hezekiah becomes king, and it seems there in the very early years, that's when the kingdom of Assyria finally takes over Israel. In Israel, the northern kingdom falls. And then as the northern kingdom falls, Hezekiah finds himself at the borders of Assyria. And the first thing Hezekiah tries to do is like his dad and pay off Assyria from taking Jerusalem. But that's not smart, because what happens when you appease a dictator? he comes back for payment number 2, right? And then he comes back for payment number 3. And Hezekiah realizes pretty fast this is not the right thing to do. And if you remember the story, Hezekiah goes into the temple and he prays to God for deliverance from the Assyrians. And Isaiah comes and says, God has heard your prayer, and he is going to deliver you from the Assyrians. And what does the angel of the Lord do that night? He kills 185,000 Assyrians, and Sennacherib, king of Assyria, has to flee back to Nineveh. And so that's sort of the big moment in the Isaiah and Hezekiah day, but the Lord protects Judah from Assyria. Hezekiah, when he dies, his 12-year-old son Manasseh takes over. And of y'all that have studied the kings, who's Manasseh? Well, he's the most wicked king of Judah that Judah ever had. And even though he has this repentant silver lining at the very end of his life, Manasseh is the most wicked. And Manasseh, instead of restoring Israel like Hezekiah did, he restores how things were before Hezekiah and pretty much destroys all of Hezekiah's restoration efforts to bring God and the law back into the people. According to the legends, so you ready? This is not in the Bible. This is a Jewish legend. The Jewish legend is that Manasseh murdered Isaiah. And the legend is that Manasseh sawed him in two to get rid of Isaiah because Isaiah evidently would have been against everything Manasseh was doing. Now, the only reason why I feel like that's worth mentioning is because the Hebrews writer in Hebrews 11 at the very end says some were sawn in two, seemingly referencing the Isaiah legend that Manasseh had him sawn in two. And I think that's why it's worth mentioning. So that's a legend. We don't have that recorded in the Bible per se, but that's probably when Isaiah dies, and that's the end of his story. What happens after Assyria takes over Israel and Manasseh has his son and then his son Josiah comes to power? Well, there's a new power in town, and that tower is Babylon. And Isaiah talks a lot about how Babylon will one day be the major world power. And then, of course, after Josiah dies, Nebuchadnezzar realizes he can go down to Judah and take Judah as well, and Judah falls to Babylon. And then Isaiah even prophesies that eventually Babylon will lose to Cyrus the Great, and even names Cyrus by name. And of course, that's the Medo-Persian Empire that are going to free the captives and restore Jerusalem so that people can return home and worship again God, and sort of setting up the world or Israel for Jesus Christ. But that's sort of the story of Isaiah, and he talks about all three of these empires because they're going to be in the next 300 years taking over Israel. So let me go back to the days of Jotham and Ahaz, and let's do a little bit of reading. Back in Isaiah 6, Isaiah is commissioned to be a prophet, and I put volunteers to be a prophet in quotation marks, because he's given the opportunity to be a prophet, but certainly it seems that he's urgent to take the job. In verse 6, it says, "Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken from tongues of the altar, and he touched my mouth with it, and said, 'Behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged.'" Isaiah's fear before God, this holy, holy, holy God, was that his sin would kill him and that God's holiness would destroy him. So the seraphim provides power from the altar, which absolutely is symbolic of Christ, and has purged him of his sin so he can speak to God. Verse 8, "Also I've heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?'" The plurality of God is sort of interesting there too, isn't it? He says, "Who shall go for us?" Now, of y'all that have studied the Bible even, when God usually commissioned prophets, what was their reaction? God asked Moses, "Who will go for us?" And what did Moses say? "Not me, I'm not an eloquent speaker." God asked Jeremiah to go, and what did Jeremiah say? "I'm too young. You need to get somebody older that can handle that." God commissioned Jonah to go to Nineveh, and what did he just say? He didn't say nothing. He got on a boat and went in the opposite direction, right? But Isaiah, when God says, "Who will go for us?" Isaiah says at the end of verse 8, "Then I said, 'Here I am, send me.'" That was what stands him apart from the other prophets in the Old Testament. He didn't have to learn how to be bold. He was bold at the very beginning. And I think that's very special that he would have this volunteering attitude, and certainly something I think we all wish we could imitate. There's a message in the early years, and that's, of course, that God will protect Judah from Assyria, which is sort of what we've already talked about, and that's the big bad guy at the time. But what's going to happen to Israel, the northern kingdom? Well, it's going to fall. And Isaiah spends a lot of time explaining that the Sumerian Empire, or the nation of Israel, is not going to be saved, and they're going to be punished for leaving God, which they did a long time ago in the days of Jeroboam. But there's hope. And the hope is, almost in every chapter, is that God will restore the throne of David. Now remember, these are in the days of Jotham and Ahaz, but there's this message that God is going to restore David and really restore Israel, united Israel to its former glory. Now, certainly we understand those things to be spiritual, but for these people, obviously, at the beginning, they took this very literally. Look at chapter 9, one of the more famous passages. In chapter 9, 1 through 2, he talks about how this mighty one will be in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. He will be in Galilee of the Gentiles. And certainly Matthew tells us that this was the prophecy that Jesus would do most of his ministry in Galilee. But in verse 6, it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice. From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." If you could take for a moment and pretend like you don't know what you know, and put yourself as a Jew who's receiving Isaiah's message for the first time, who do you think is going to be born? Do you not think it's going to be a political leader? Because sort of all of the thoughts here in verse 6 is that, the government will be on his shoulders, right? Verse 7, and the increase of his government and peace. And that he's going to stand on the throne of David and he's going to establish order and justice and judgment, right? And sort of like a removal of the corruption and the bad things going on in the day, we're going to be given a new king, and that new king will establish true justice. And when you read passages like this, you know why the Pharisees and even the apostles at the beginning were looking for a government. They were looking for a new political leader that was going to overthrow the captives, and he was going to rescue the captives from the occupiers, Rome. And that's why they believed those things, right? Look also in chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. "There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord." Things that we usually use to describe King Solomon. And so out of the branch of Jesse, David and Solomon's family, will come a new Solomon. And the Holy Spirit will rest on him and give him all this wisdom and power to enact this justice. And this is the hopeful thought that is given in the days of Jotham and Ahaz. This is what's going to repair everything. Now, again, if you're living as a Jew in the days of Ahaz, and you hear these things, who do you think is going to fulfill these prophecies? Well, I think for most, they thought it was Hezekiah. And in a sense, some of these things do fit Hezekiah, don't they? That he is going to restore wisdom and justice to Judah, and he is going to bring them back to these days of peace. He's going to bring them back to these days of wealth like they saw in the Solomon years. And I think certainly some of these prophecies do fit Hezekiah. But ultimately, of course, they fit Jesus, especially with things that don't work with Hezekiah, like at the beginning of chapter 9 when it said that he was going to reside in the Galilee of the Gentiles. Hezekiah never lived in the Galilee of the Gentiles, but who did live in the Galilee of the Gentiles? Jesus did, and did most of his ministry there. So ultimately, in every chapter almost, the hope that is going to save us from this wicked world is the Messiah, this new throne of David that God will restore. And this is what the people, of course, are looking forward to in one of the major themes of Isaiah. Here's the second major theme of Isaiah, Babylon. What's neat about this is that Isaiah would have never lived long enough to see the Babylon occupation. He would have never even seen Babylon in its full power. These are things that are going to happen 100 years after him. But he spends a lot of time talking about Babylon. In Isaiah 39, just to sum up the story, Hezekiah has been very sick. Presumably, this is the reason why God gave him 15 more years. Perhaps it's the same sickness. And these Babylonian ambassadors show up with gifts because they heard Hezekiah was sick. And Babylon is just kind of these nobodies right now. And they show up to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah, just like a good host would, he gives them a tour of Jerusalem. And y'all have these people. Y'all know these people, right? You go over to their house for dinner, and what do they want to do first? They want to give you a tour of the house. How many of you like those tours? Actually, I do. I love tours. I ask for them, right? But, some of us don't. But this is what Hezekiah does. He's like, hey, I'm going to tour my house. And he shows them all the wealth he's accumulated. Not only that, but he goes and shows them some of the house of the Lord and the wealth that has been there since the days of Solomon. And it's sort of this thing like, well, you can't go in, but you can look. Look at all these things even our God has up here on top of the mountain. Well, after that, Isaiah walks in. And Isaiah says, hey, Hezekiah, I saw you had some folks over. Who were they? And what does Hezekiah answer? Oh, they were these people from this far country. Don't worry about it, Isaiah. And Isaiah says, thus says the Lord, these Babylonians that you just had over, you just told them about how wealthy Jerusalem really is. And you have just revealed to Babylon, this foreign power, how much money is actually sitting right here. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to come back and they're going to rob it one day. And what is Hezekiah's response? Well, will it happen in my lifetime? The answer to that is no. It's going to happen to his great-great-grandchildren. And he's like, well, at least there'll be peace in my days. And that's sort of how the end of Isaiah's story ends with Hezekiah. I watched an interview a long time ago about a burglar who had been caught but had robbed many, many people in many, many houses. And they were interviewing him about, his criminal activity. And he said, and this has stayed with me, that people will put NRA bumper stickers on their car, the National Rifle Association, thinking that it keeps burglars out. Don't come rob me, I have guns. But he says what that really tells burglars is, I have guns, come rob me. Follow me home and just make sure till I leave and then go steal all my guns, right? And certainly this is sort of what's happened to Hezekiah. He's let everybody know how much he has, and now he's found him some burglars to come take it. And so Isaiah prophesies at the very get-go that Babylon will be back and Babylon will cause Jerusalem to fall. But this isn't new information. God had already prophesied through Isaiah that Babylon would take over Jerusalem. Go all the way back to chapter 14. And I imagine this was very early in Isaiah's ministry that God had already prophesied that Babylon would destroy Jerusalem, take them captive, but ultimately be defeated. 14:3 says this, it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord gives you rest from sorrow and from your fear and the hard bondage in which you were made to serve, that you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, this is early. The king of Babylon isn't even alive yet. But God's saying, hey, Isaiah, I'm going to go ahead and give you a prophecy to write down about the king of Babylon when I defeat him, when I need him to free my people that he's going to take captive. And we have a famous verse in verse 12 that's addressed to the king of Babylon. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How were you cut down to the ground, you who are weak in the nations? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, and I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of the congregation from the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the high of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. Now, typically, verse 12, we get there and we see the word Lucifer, and the pop culture world freaks out. And as you know, pop culture calls the devil Lucifer in our world that we live in today. However, is he talking about the devil here? I think verse 3 gives us the answer. Verse 4. That you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, who is he writing to? Well, he's writing to the king of Babylon. And the word Lucifer there in verse 12, all the word means, and maybe they should have translated it instead of transliterating like they did, but they should have translated, the word is just bright morning star. It's just the morning star. And he's saying it very sarcastically to the king of Babylon. Oh, morning star, oh, son of the morning. You think you're so high, you think you're so mighty. No, you're going to fall all the way to the gates of death. And you can see the sarcasm that's coming out of God's voice talking to the king of Babylon. Do y'all know any kings of Babylon that this would really fit really, really well? What about Nebuchadnezzar and what happened in Daniel 4? When he got so high and mighty and God had to humble him to nothing. What about Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, that got so high and mighty and God had to write something on the wall that scared him so bad that told him that King Cyrus was at the door and he was going to die that night. That fits these two people very well. And I think that's who the prophecy is addressed to. It's addressed to the king of Babylon. And just one quick thing before we leave. Caleb just led it for us. We sing the song, The Lily of the Valley, and it takes a line out of Revelation. Who is the morning star? Who is Lucifer? It's a title that we have given Jesus Christ. And when we would say it, because pop culture says it about the devil, I think it's kind of blasphemous, maybe unknowingly, but I do think it's kind of blasphemous. It's a title that the apostles have given Jesus Christ, the morning star. And this is said sarcastically about the king of Babylon. And I think if we have a little bit better of a biblical understanding, we could use these words the way that the Bible uses these words. Finally, God prophesies that King Cyrus will return the captives of Babylon and rebuild the temple. Look at Isaiah 44. This is 250 years, or almost 250 years, before the Medo-Persian Empire takes over the world. And this is what God does. He actually names the king that's going to do it. And we're sitting 200 years before this king is even born. In 49:28, the very last verse of that chapter, he says, 44:28, the very last verse of that chapter, he says, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, into the temple, your foundation shall be laid. What is this Cyrus going to do? Well, he's going to rebuild Jerusalem. He's going to rebuild the temple. And by the way, back in 538, Cyrus began that project. 45, verse 1, thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. That word to his anointed there is the word Messiah, by the way. It's a little M Messiah, but it is the word Messiah. To Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, to loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. That Cyrus was going to be this very powerful figure that God was going to open all the doors for. Why? Because he was the one who's chosen by God. He's a Messiah to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, this is what's so wild. How in the world can you name a king by name 200 years and then talk about what he's going to do 200 years before he's even born? The only answer is that you have some type of divine being that is communicating that to you from a different realm. That's the only answer to that question, right? And frankly, this passage causes a lot of problems for unbelievers. Because how in the world can Isaiah say something like that and it be true 200 years later? I mean, even the naming guy by name. Well, what's the only place they can go to? The only defense to that is to say that Isaiah was written much later than Isaiah says it was written. But what's the problem with that? There's no historical evidence to ever believe that Isaiah was written after the days of Hezekiah. I mean, we have Hezekiah's coins that have Hezekiah's name on one side and Isaiah's name on the other. We have pots from the days of Hezekiah that have Isaiah's name written on it, Isaiah the prophet. And all of these things 200 years before Cyrus was even thought of. So I think, again, this is very powerful evidence that whoever Isaiah's God was is the one and true living God. Because only the only one and true living God can say things like this 200 years before and be right. And so some of this stuff is sort of scary, that things can be so accurate and so perfect over so many years of time. Let's do like a take home of Isaiah and mention 3 of these themes in The Lesson Will Be Yours and sort of try to move it forward to today. In Isaiah, times were bad. And that's sort of one of the messages of Isaiah. And every couple of chapters, when you get into a different prophecy, that's sort of what it's about, is that times are bad and they're not very good. Look all the way back in chapter 5 with me one more time. Here in the introduction to Isaiah, God says that I've made Judah like a vineyard, and I've worked hard in that vineyard, and I've removed rocks out of that vineyard. But for some reason, there's no fruit in my vineyard. And the answer is because y'all are evil. That's why there's no fruit in my vineyard. In verse 8, God says, woe to those who join house to house. They add field to field, till there is no place where they dwell alone in the midst of the land. In my hearing, the Lord of hosts said, truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield 1 ephah. Those are very small amounts for a lot of land. What's the problem here at the beginning of Isaiah? The problem is that the wealthier got wealthier, and the poor got poorer. And there seemed to be no sort of equality or anything amongst the people in Judah. Is that a foreign problem to us? Or do we understand that? And by the way, then look at verse 11. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may follow intoxicating drink, who continue until night, till wine inflames them. The harp and the strings and the tambourine and the flute and the wine are in their feasts, but they do not regard the work of the Lord, nor consider the operation of his hands. You know, when you got the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, in verse 11, it seems like everybody is just living for the next buzz or the next way they can just numb themselves to the reality of the world. And what do people live for in verse 12? They live for their Spotify playlist. I mean, the only good thing they got is music. And let's face it, our music the past 5 years has been really bad. Maybe that's an opinion. You know, I mean, what else do they got to live for? They live for alcohol and they live for music. And then here, maybe the worst line of all at the end of verse 12. They do not regard the work of the Lord nor consider the operation of his hands. Does their world or does their society care about God? Their society couldn't care less about God. And they're living in these very numb, dark realities, aren't they? Those are the days of Isaiah. And those are the days of their society. Look also in chapter 10, if you will. Just these first couple of verses in chapter 10. Verse 1, woe to those who decree unrighteousness decrees, who write misfortune which they have prescribed, to rob the needy of justice, and to take what is right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. What is he describing here? He's describing political corruption, that nobody can get justice. And those that are the most weakest and the most less fortunate, they're the ones that suffer the most. And people take advantage of them, and nobody cares. Were times bad in the days of Isaiah? Times were terrible in the days of Isaiah. And I think some of these things even apply to the reign of Hezekiah. Hezekiah is just one man. He didn't have the power to fix every problem. Times were bad. But what's Isaiah's solution in every section? When will things get better? And I think you can probably guess. When does Isaiah say things will be better? He says things will be better when the Messiah comes. That's when things will be better. If you go all the way to Isaiah 53, which of course is the most famous prophecy in here about Jesus, but I just want to read verse 11. Verse 10 is the famous line, it pleased the Lord to bruise him, but this is the solution that calls, verse 11. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Isaiah is saying, you're living in a world filled of greed and deception and sin. What's the solution? The solution is the Messiah. The Messiah will make things better. If you want to live in a reality of justice with the iniquities been removed, the solution is God's servant, the Messiah. That's the solution, right? Now, I sort of skipped the middle here, but let me go ahead and move into our days. Can we not say that our days are bad? I know as individuals, we can have good years and bad years regardless of what's going on with our neighbors. But, generally, usually what people comes out of people's mouths is, times are bad. Times are bad right now. I had a buddy the other day that I was trying to encourage to move to Gardendale and come to church here at Gardendale. And that's what I was, really trying to push to him. And he looked at me straight in the eyes and just said, I can't afford Gardendale. Man, that hurt. That hurt rough. And then even on top of that, many of us are living in realities where our bills are more and more expensive, but our paychecks just aren't keeping up with it. And we're concerned and we're worried. I mean, it's a logical reaction to those things. We're worried about greed. We're worried about our friends and our loved ones that have just given themselves over to drugs and alcohol because they don't know of any other solutions. We're worried about our neighbors that don't consider the operation of God's hands. We worry about our politics and how corrupt all of our officials are, and we're just like, man, times are bad. And by the way, just a little prophecy of my own, prediction, not prophecy. Next year, Lord willing, when we have our election, regardless of who wins that presidential election, guess what I'll still be able to say next year? Times are bad. It doesn't matter. Like, times are always going to be bad, and they've always been bad since Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. And then they had children, and things were better. And then what happened? One of their sons murdered one of their other sons. Times were bad. We just kind of perpetually in times are bad. Well, if Isaiah was here with us, what would he say the answer to this question is, which is, well, by the way, what we ask each other all the time. When will things get better? What's the answer to that? Things will get better when the Messiah returns. That's the true answer to that question, right? You can stay in Isaiah. I need to go back to Isaiah. But Romans 8 says this about when the Messiah returns. Verse 23, not only that, but we also are the first fruits of the Spirit, even ourselves grown within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. That's not the redemption of your souls. That's already happened. This is eagerly waiting for the Lord to return and redeem us from these pitiful, sinful bodies we live in. That's the Messiah returning. And then he even goes on to say in verse 25, but we hope for what we do not see. We eagerly wait for it with perseverance. That when are things going to be better? This is the answer. It's when the Messiah returns. That's when things are going to be better, right? And I think that's an apostle message that we see foreshadowed in the days of Isaiah. But what about till then? And I think Isaiah answers that for his people. While they're waiting on the Messiah's first coming, there is a message in Isaiah that God will preserve his people. And if you're still in Isaiah, look at chapter 49. Here, God actually uses the word preserve twice. None of these people who are the original audience, got to see the Messiah in their lifetime. In verse 6, indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. Let me pause. The thought is he's saying, for God, it is a really small thing to protect his people. Does it take God a lot of effort to preserve us and keep his people? It doesn't take God a lot of effort. He can do it very easily. It is a too small thing to even think that would be a struggle for him to preserve and restore Israel. But this is the purpose in that, the next half of 6. I will give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. Let me pause again. The thought is that God is going to allow the Israelites to go into captivity. But those that are really God's people, he's going to protect and he's going to preserve. And God even says, I have a purpose in this. The captivity's purpose is to spread you out throughout the whole world so you can be a light to the Gentiles. And by the day when we get to the days of Paul, Paul gets to go see Jewish communities in every city he travels and go to those synagogues. And those synagogues had already been teaching the Gentiles about God long before Paul got there. Was there a purpose to the captivity? There was a purpose. It was to bring God's name to the Gentiles. Verse 7, thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, their Holy One, to him whose man despises, to him that their nation abhors, to the servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise, princes also shall come worship, because the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, and he has chosen you. This is God. And you have people that has chosen him. And what has he done in return? He has chosen you. Is he going to protect you? Is he going to preserve you? Of course he is. And things for God's people are always going to be okay, no matter how bad the times are. And as they're patiently and eagerly waiting the Messiah coming, God's going to preserve them. And he has a purpose for doing so, right? Well, let me move this forward one more time. Jude 1:1, just the address to his audience. He calls them, to those that are called, sanctified by God the Father, and preserved in Christ Jesus. Are God's people preserved today? Yes, they are. And times are bad, and we're waiting for the Messiah to come back to make things better. Are we going to still be okay, though, as we're waiting for the Messiah to return? Yeah, we are going to be okay. And I think that's a very comforting thought. Let me make another prediction. Next year, regardless of what happens with the election, Lord willing, if the earth is still spinning, Let me make a prediction that I'm pretty 100% confident about. God's people will still be here, and God's people will be okay. Let me go ahead and make a prediction for the 1,000 years from now. If the Lord allows the earth to keep on spinning, God's people will still be here, and they'll still be okay. Well, you know what? Let me just go ahead and make a prediction 10,000 years from now. Lord willing, if the earth is still spinning, God's people will still be here, and they'll still be okay. Why? Because God is going to preserve his people. And every time Paul gives a prophecy about the end of the world, what does he always talk about? He talks about how there's going to be Christians on the earth, and they're going to be the ones taken up first. God's people will still be here, and we will still be okay. Because that's the type of God we have. And it's just one thought. Why doesn't God just come back now? You know, and he could come back now. But if we go to next week and we're still here next Sunday, why didn't God come back now? Because we tell God about how bad things are, and we tell God about how wicked the world we live in, and we complain to God about how terrible things are. Why doesn't God just come back now? I think the answer is the same answer Isaiah had for the Jews in 49:6. I will give you as a light to the Gentiles. Why are we still here as of right now? Because God needs us here to be a light to the Gentiles, to the light to the unbelievers. You know, why is it that you've had to suffer these past couple of years? Why is it that God hadn't returned yet? You know, why has this church suffered so much the way it has? It's because God needs the people of this church here to be a light to the Gentiles. And just this past month, we baptized 3 people in this baptistry. Not that they needed to be baptized in that baptistry, but you get my point. You know, the past month, things have been rough. Why are we still here? So we can be a light to the Gentiles. That's why we're still here. And I'm a little bit more okay with my suffering when I know that God has a purpose. And things will be better when he returns. Thank you for your attention. And maybe at the least, that'll just make Isaiah mean that much more to us. If there's anyone here that has yet to obey the gospel, there's a lot of rewards that come with obeying the gospel. One is preservation. That means that whether in life or death, you're going to be preserved. You're going to be preserved in Christ Jesus. And that's a powerful or good reason to obey the gospel, is you just want to survive. And you want to survive even what comes after next, after this life ends. That's a great reason to obey the gospel. Here's another great reason to go obey the gospel. Jesus is coming back. And for us that are God's people, that is going to be the best day of our lives. But for us that are not God's people, that's going to be the worst day of our lives. Why not just take the free gift and make it the best day of your life? In my mind, logically, that's a pretty easy solution. And I think that's the solution that Isaiah would have presented to us as well. If there's any way we can spiritually assist, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?